eternal city. I have seen the end of days, and years from now men will say, here began the fall of Rome. The Senate was taken from the many and given to the few. Those who wore the golden wreath grew sick with every kind of wickedness. They were filled with greed, deceit, and malice. They condemned and enslaved. They betrayed their friends and murdered those they loved. They did all this and called it just. And I saw in his hand a book sealed with 7 seals, the first of which was broken. And behold, a white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and he went forth to conquer. The air was filled with smoke and blood.
The Imperator campaign of Rome II has us take a dive into the crisis of the 1st century BC. By this point, the Roman Republic had gained considerable land holdings in Europe, and by 41 BC had near total control of the entire Mediterranean, and extending as far as their newly conquered lands in Germania. But there was one issue. The Republic, and later Empire, had a tendency to constantly be embroiled in deadly civil wars, and this one was a noteworthy one. Known as the Liberator's Civil War, the catalyst for this particular one was the assassination of Julius Caesar by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. His death sparked the civil war between Octavius, his prodigal apprentice, who was joined by Mark Antony, and together they launched a campaign against the traitors, who were backed up by legions that defected to their side. This war ultimately culminated in the Battle of Philippi, which saw the rebels and the Republic fight a month-long battle in October. Cassius offed himself after believing Brutus had failed in the first engagement, which turned out to be a false report, so ouch. But come the 23rd, after a lengthy fight, the Republic came out on top and Brutus then offed himself, in a more appropriate fashion. What followed was a massive power vacuum between Octavius, Mark Antony, Marcus Lepidus, and Sextus Pompey, of which the game is set in. The campaign itself doesn't really have a set story. I mean, the entirety of the Total War series is like that. But it does have goals. There are other playable factions in the game, and while they're deserving of their own videos, we must focus on the 4 Roman ones. The same goes for Attila. The goals vary slightly, but they all lead back to one thing: Rome. As either Lepidus, Antony, or Pompey, you must tackle Octavius and then focus on the other factions. And as Octavius, you must preserve the integrity of Rome and wipe out the other 3 factions that stand in your way, whilst expanding your control over the Mediterranean beyond. Pretty typical for the entire series, Rome 2 is top-down with a massive table-like map, of which you move with turns. Each turn has to be precise, as one fuck-up can cost you an entire fleet or army if you're not prepared, or even settlements. But there's more to it. The player must micromanage their ever-growing domain. Early game is all about lightning conquests, and that comes to a snail's pace late game as you must begin to mostly switch to defense against barbarian and eastern factions like Parthia. Once you take a region, you must make sure that you Romanize it, as if you don't convert the population, it can lead to civil war, an all-out rebellion. The main package deal of the gameplay are the battles. The staples of the Total War series are its massively scaled battles. Each unit type is wildly different and historically prevalent in their roles: cavalry, artillery, melee, and ranged units. Ships come in all shapes and sizes. Their respective strength differs depending on what you're playing. The Romans have powerful naval units and excellent infantry and cavalry, for instance, and as you progress, you can research technology to create better farms or settlements, or unlock entirely new units to strengthen your armies. And speaking of strength, there's diplomacy. Like any good leader, you must create strong relations or risk making new enemies. Establishing trade routes with neighboring kingdoms and clans or forging alliances is a solid way to ensure a steadfast victory. There's plenty more, but I must move on. But one last note: mods. Vanilla is awesome, but the mods further enhance the experience. Divide and Imperia, my favorite one, is essentially a gigantic overhaul of the base game, turning it into the Total War Rome 2 that it should really be, adding new tech, new and revamped unit rosters, and much, much more. It's essentially a dream come true.
You built an empire beyond imagining. The pinnacle of human achievement and the envy of the world. Did you think it would last? The Eternal City. That glorious monument to power, culture, and learning. But the old wolf lies wounded by jackals, circled by vultures. Worried to death by 1,000 tiny vicious mouths brought low by your own arrogance. These are the death throes of Rome. The light of civilization dims and gathers. And you've such precious time left to hide your women, for your children to cry. Even at the moment of your final defeat, you will take no comfort in oblivion. For I am coming for you. I ride with 1,000,000 warriors! I bring the end of days! I am the Scourge of God! And I will watch your world burn.
Now let's go ahead a few hundred years to the end of antiquity and the beginning of a new dark age. By this point, Rome had grown so large that it had become hard to govern and had to be split into two separate entities, Western and Eastern Rome. The first change began with Diocletian in 286 CE, followed by Constantine moving the East's capital from Byzantium to the newly constructed one named after him, Constantinople, in 330 CE. But it wasn't until 395 CE that the reforms eventually ended with East and West, with the death of Theodosius I. This is where the game begins. Like Rome 2, the story is very non-linear, with it based on the events of that time period, and being set about a decade before the birth of Attila the Hun, giving you enough time to prepare for his wrath on the empires, which funnily enough, he liked the West but hated the East, but he ended up contributing heavily to their downfall. Anyways, allowing players to carve out their own paths with a set goal in mind. This time as either the West or East. The West is unlike its former self. Old men squabbling about the good old days, and in constant civil war with inept emperors at the throne. However, the East is its savior. Thanks to its many reforms, it has managed to become an economic and military powerhouse that overshadows its older half. And with threats from old and new enemies, you must endure against more hardship. Attila is practically a clone of Rome too, but instead of conquest at first, it's all about survival. Players must sacrifice huge swaths of territory, especially as the West, to preserve the most integral parts of their empire. So if you decide to play as them, be prepared to take constant L's at first. And the East doesn't fare much better, with constant threat from Attila's Hunnic hordes and other barbarian tribes in the eastern factions. This is where the new gameplay elements come into play. These quote-unquote hordes, as they're called, are migratory clans that will try their damnedest to sack or completely control one of your cities. And while they move, they essentially create their own town on wheels. And on the topic of settlements, there's pestilence. Disease will run rife through your regions if left unchecked, diminishing public order and leading to rebellion. Also, fire spreads during sieges as a new mechanic, so fuck yeah to arson. And like Rome 2, the mods in Attila slap. The best one is probably 1212, which is a complete conversion, turning it into another Total War medieval title, so make sure to check it out. Now let's jump over 1,000 years later to the Age of Enlightenment. The game is set at the very beginning of the 18th century and is set smack dab in the middle of Europe's biggest conflict of the century so far, the Great Northern War. During this time, a coalition led by the Tsardom of Russia under Peter the Great was formed in order to halt the advance of the slightly fresh but powerful Swedish Empire under Charles XII, also set during the height of the rush to the New World and a plethora of other noteworthy events. As the two previous entries suggest, you get the general gist. This time, you must colonize, expand, or survive on the biggest map out of all the other games on this list, well, the series in general, spanning 2 continents and the Indian subcontinent, and you have guns. As the British, you take control of India and take territories from your Spanish and French adversaries, or play as Sweden and dominate the coalition, and the possibilities go on and on and on. As mentioned previously, now that you have firearms, you have to drastically change your playstyle. No rushing with melee unless it is deemed necessary, or if you play as the Native Americans, tribes, or any other faction that is lagging behind a gunpowder technology, then it's mostly hack and slash with some firearm action on the side. Sieges are slightly different as well. Instead of attacking towns or whole cities, your army will attack the garrison itself, who is stationed in star forts or any other fort located on the outskirts of any city or town. Oh, and naval engagements are fun as hell too. It's awesome seeing ships blow their cannonballs to each other. Unlike the previous two titles, Rome 2 and Attila, where the naval engagements were lacking, and especially in Rome, where they were pretty buggy. And in this game, they're actually really fucking fun. Oh, and also Creative Assembly, if you're watching this, for the love of God, please make another gunpowder game. I beg of you. Oh, Red Dead isn't necessarily inspired by any particular historical event, it's just really inspired by one whole time period, the Wild West. However, its story is nothing short of excellent. Being set in 1911 in the fictionalized states of New Austin, West Elizabeth, and the Mexican state of Nuevo Paraiso, the story follows John Marston, a former gang member turned government-sanctioned bounty hunter, who is tasked with hunting down his former gang members in hiding, as the government is holding his family away as leverage. It's all I will get to, as you honestly should play it if you haven't, and yes, I know it's been out for 14 years, but hey, I'm just a chill guy. The gameplay does not hold back. Typical of the majority of Rockstar's titles, the game is a third-person open-world action-adventure, and there is plenty of that. Being a Western, the gunplay gives off a gritty vibe that makes you really feel that you're in the middle of a Wild West shootout, and there is an amazing little addition to that feel, Deadeye. The staple of the game is this feature, which allows players to log on to multiple targets in slow motion and eviscerate them in a hail of lead. There's also horses. And don't forget the Strangers and Freaks, another staple of Rockstar's games. Traveling along the dusty roads of New Austin, or visiting the town across the border, the towns across the border in Nuevo Paraiso really gives that feel of being in the shoes of a gun-toting outlaw, a former outlaw, to be specific. Jesus Christ be praised. This time we head off to the 15th century, set in Bohemia during the political upheaval it was experiencing between Wenceslaus IV and Hungarian King Sigismund, who tried to take the throne of Bohemia by force. And I will add it's in a region that is pretty overlooked in historical media, with the majority of time spent in Western Europe and not really Eastern Europe. The plot follows Henry, a young man who survived an attack on his village of Skalitz by Sigismund's invading army, in which he loses his family and goes on a revenge quest against the German captain who killed him, joining the service of real historical figures like Sir Rikik, Radzik Kobila, Sir Hanush, and Sir Divish, for example. All of which were given spotlights thanks to this game, as they were, and still kinda are, relatively unknown. I mean, look at their Wikipedia page, they're short as fuck. The gameplay is what really shines about this game. I recently had the chance to finally play, and let me tell you, I wanted to chuck my monitor out the window. And I mean that in a good way. The combat, while feeling sluggish at times, is damn near smooth. The clanking of plate armor being hit by a mace or the rattling of chainmail against a warhammer is so satisfying, but as hinted, it comes with a pretty steep learning curve, and in terms of an RPG, it excels at that, with the world feeling alive like no other. The closest game I can think of that's similar is Witcher 3. Only difference, I ain't got no silver for monsters, and traveling along the country roads of Bohemia, and getting jumped by Hungarian-speaking humans, or some scrawny band of peasants. It's a 10 out of 10 experience in my book. Now, let's move on to the fun part. Let's begin by taking a generalized look at the Total War titles that I mentioned. They, for the most part, are solid games, but as mentioned earlier, what I believe is their strongest suit is the brevity of their encyclopedias. For this section, we'll be using an example each from the 3 titles, but we'll begin with 2. And I'll be giving a little history lesson for each one. Let's begin with Attila. Quote, "The history of warfare in the Roman age is incredibly well documented, so we are able to build a clear and concise pictures of the battles they fought and the weapons and techniques they used. Yet there is one weapon that remains a mystery: Greek fire. Although we know of its existence, its origins are shadowy, and the ingredients from which this deadly substance was made has been completely lost to history. Greek fire was a mix of liquid chemicals that could be siphoned from a cauldron, sprayed through a tube, and then ignited. It was capable of clinging fast to any material and can burn through the flesh of a man in seconds. The flames were seemingly inexhaustible, and its victims had little hope of putting them out, as dousing with water was futile. Contemporary sources tell us that the substance was even able to burn in water, and that there were very few substances that could quench it, including sand, vinegar, and bizarrely, old urine. Greek fire was able to burn both on and underwater, making it a highly effective naval weapon, but one which could easily get out of control and destroy its users. Those brave enough to try could create a sheet of flame that rapidly consumed any ship it touched. So what the hell is Greek fire? Well, as explained in the text, it is a complete mystery. Well, the vast majority of Roman technology is a complete mystery, and I'll be damned if I have to go down that rabbit hole. Anyways, the weapon's origins are pretty straightforward. In 672 AD, after the Arab conquest of the eastern territories of the empire, a Greek architect named Kallinikos of Heliopolis arrived as a refugee to the gates of Constantinople. There, he managed to meet Emperor Constantine IV Pogonatus, and the rest is history. The device saw extensive use as a naval weapon, and also as a land weapon for almost 1,000 years, until the final siege of Constantinople in 1453. There, it was used by a Scottish mercenary named John Grant to flush out Ottoman sappers. By this point in history, the ailing empire was heavily reliant on foreign assistance, mainly from the Italian states. Having been surrounded by the Ottomans, and it was also used in an attempt to destroy the Ottoman blockade in the Golden Horn, the estuary that surrounds the city, now modern-day Istanbul, to no avail. After the fall of the city, the technology was lost to history. Also, even though the game's main campaign begins in 395, technology like Greek fire, and all the rest can be acquired well before their arrival date. Inaccurate, of course, but for gameplay reasons it makes sense. But apart from its military prowess, Rome was an economic monster. Here's an excerpt from one of the civil technology sections. Quote, "The fringes of the Roman Empire were home to some of the more specialist industries, whereas in the imperial heartlands, industry gradually became a mass-produced system of fabrique and latifunde, dia. Urban life dictating the demand for cheap mass-produced items be high. Provinces like Britannia and Egypt maintain their own specialist industries. In Egypt, the best documented of all the imperial provinces, the production of high-quality textiles was its specialty. The items were produced to a high standard using traditional techniques and materials, and exported around the known world. Likewise, in Britannia, excavation continues to unearth unusually large quantities of high-quality pottery, indicating that its production was a specialty of the region. Rome's mighty right hand stretched far and wide. Archaeological evidence as far away as Korea showed proof of this might. And in terms of the overall industry, each corner of the empire served its purpose. Egypt, apart from being a hub for textiles, was also Rome's breadbasket. Sicily formerly held that title before the Romans took control of Egypt from the Ptolemaic kingdom. Other provinces like Hispania, or modern Spain, Dacia, and Illyria, the Balkans, served as the centers for silver and iron, whilst Gaul, modern-day France, and wider Germania, modern-day Germany, served their lumber means. Now, let's jump back a few hundred years to Rome too. By the way, the encyclopedia for Rome 2 is a little scuffed, but I'll make do. Let's talk about this quote from the military section, more specifically the management subsections. With the Marian reforms, joining the Roman army became a full-time occupation. Men trained all year round, not just during the campaign season, where Rome was under threat. Legionaries were expected to be able to find a number of formations with a variety of weapons. These skills were then tested in mock training battles. The captured Jewish leader, Josephus, witnessed such drills and offered a vivid account of the violence that took place. Quote, "It would be fair enough to call their drills bloodless battles and their battles bloody drills." Before I talk about the history of the Marian reforms, I want to close in on Josephus' remark. That is exactly why the Roman military was so effective. They strived for perfection, no matter the cost. A great example of this is the corvus. This naval weapon was created during the First Punic War in response to Carthage's naval superiority, bringing their land superiority to the waves. This is just one of many examples of their stubbornness. Anyways, let's talk about the Marian reforms. Although modern debates question whether he was the one that was the creator or at least a contributor to these reforms, the latter being widely accepted, it's still credited to him. Marian was a Roman consul and general during the Republic days that oversaw the reforms of Rome's military doctrine. These reforms saw many changes, the biggest of which was the structure of Rome's legions. The structure of the Republican manipular system was a class system that based the role of a soldier's place within a legion based off of their societal status, such as wealth or age, and was as follows. Velites, comprising the poorest or youngest troops, these men were exclusively very light skirmishers, equipped with javelins primarily. Infantry composed the hastati at the front. These were men in their early 20s and wore light armor. Principes were men considered to be in their prime. They were primarily medium infantry in the middle. The old veterans, or the triarii, were the last line of defense. They were heavily armed and armored. These troops were flanked by the skirmishers, and their cavalry, or equites, the elite of Roman society, filled this role as they were able to afford it. But thanks to the reforms, all of this was thrown out the window with the onset of the imperial age. Instead, they opted for individuality. As time went on, their ideal candidate for legionary was a rural farm dude, and the roles of engineers for war machines like Scorpios or Ballistae, or range units or cavalry, were filled with auxiliary troops from across the empire. So what about empire? Well, I have a really good example. The fur trade, which thrives in the American frontier forest, is a rich source of men who are reliant on their marksmanship for survival. With no ready access to the kind of manufacturing found in Europe, this hardy and self-sufficient breed have learned to fashion their own rifles. The guns themselves reflect the demands made by their environment. With an unusually long rifled barrel, they are far more accurate than any smoothbore musket, an important factor when powder and shot are hard to come by, and game must be stalked for many hours before a shot can be taken. This distinctive design is, however, slightly awkward to reload. The skills of the hunter translate well to the battlefield, especially when employed against regular troops who often have no experience of such tactics and no answer to a foe who appears as if from nowhere, and will not then stand still to be shot at. Adept at concealing themselves amongst trees, these men can stalk any prey, remaining hidden as they slowly move within range. The New World presented all sorts of challenges to the European ways of fighting. Guerrilla warfare was a concept that was used but wasn't adapted to such an extreme extent as compared to the New World. And out of this new age came new technology like the famous long rifle, an invention of German blacksmiths that had settled in southeastern Pennsylvania in the early 18th century. The long rifles were built for hunting in the unique geography, but come in the American Revolution, they proved their worth as reliable weapons of war. Used by frontiersmen, who became specialized irregular units under Daniel Morgan, he used them to great advantage, with them being used to snipe William Howe's troops as they retreated through New Jersey after the defeats in the campaigning season of 1776 through 77. Now, with the history lessons complete, let's move on to examining the worlds of Red Dead Redemption and Kingdom Come Deliverance. But let's start with Red Dead. The world that Rockstar created is seen as an excellent example of environmental storytelling. It has been such an inspiration that it was used as a basis for the world of Ghost of Tsushima. Well, the storytelling part, two entirely different time periods. Watch out for a Tsushima video next year. But it is next year's. I wrote this in 2024, so look out for it this year. Anyways, stagecoaches with rotting wood, decaying towns. Everywhere you go, you see a remnant of the past, still clinging to life. Possibly the best examples are of Tumbleweed, Armadillo, and Blackwater. Tumbleweed is a dead town, a once thriving settlement worn away by progress around it, and now inhabited by outlaws and ghosts. You may remember the whole thing with the haunting on the mansion on the hill, which turned out to be NPCs and the walls, which is just really anticlimactic for an ending to such a very long-running legend. There you go, legend. It's a word that is very rarely used in games nowadays, which sucks. Anyways, let's move on to Armadillo, a dying western town stuck in the middle of an inhospitable desert. All manners of life come and go through this decadent place. It is also where you begin your journey controlling John, a symbolic gesture of sorts, just like the opening cutscene that you had just witnessed in the previous few minutes. Moving east, we hit Blackwater, a preview of the future: electricity, police officers, and even cars. Modern amenities for a modern age. It's as though we see the past, present, and future all in these three locations. However, the biggest median of this storytelling is John Marston himself. A quick-witted and simple-minded individual, John is a piece of the dying West itself. Through him, we see and hear a man haunted by his past and tormented by the present. And in the times that he tries to escape, such as trying to start a family, he's kept in purgatory by the government, who is trying to erase the dying West once and for all. But before they can do that, they must use him as a pawn, hunting down and killing or imprisoning his former gang members before turning on him in the end. As even though he has changed, or at least tries to change for the better, he is still a nuisance in their eyes, and therefore must be eradicated, a fate he sealed long ago, the final piece of an unfinished artwork of suffering and regret. Admittedly, I got a little bleak there at the end, but let's move on to something slightly more cheerful. As mentioned in the overview, the game itself is superb, but what about the world of Bohemia? Well, it's just as alive and rich as the other aspects, if not even more so. Warhorse Studios, the developers behind Kingdom Come Deliverance, had a home field advantage. Being based out of Prague, the studio managed to get the help of local historians, even architects, to create an authentic feel for the world. Visiting Rate, or the beginning in Skalitz, really gets you into the shoes of a medieval citizen. And similar to that of the Total War games, the in-game menu is filled to the brim with historical details and facts about the factions, settlements, and characters. A personal favorite of mine is this little detail. A little spoiler alert, but about halfway through the game, as a part of the main quest line, you have to infiltrate a monastery, and once you do, you'll unlock the little note about the real place in your journal. And within the text, they mention that the names of the brothers are their actual names put into the records of the monastery. Yeah, and that's just one example. This game is actually one of the very few games where it's enjoyable to read through everything. Hell, the game is so immersive you'll probably be sidetracked just moseying through the woods, of which the detail is almost unrivaled. And mind you, this game came out the same year as Red Dead Redemption 2, 2018. And for one final thing, the game touches on is something that is almost overlooked in media. The Turkic people of the medieval age, specifically the Cumans, who are now a dead Turkic group that was prevalent around that time. The ones you encounter in game are hostile, as they are a part of Sigismund's invading army, and they speak Hungarian, as they were driven from their homeland 2 centuries prior by marauding Mongol hordes. Settling in Hungary, and over time, even though they had a foothold there, they fully settled there thanks to the Mongols, and over time, they assimilate into their culture. The game is way too big for this video, and is deserving of its own. There probably are a bunch of videos out there analyzing the game in complete detail, and you probably should check those out. This is just like kind of a little introduction to all the historical facets of these games. These titles are ever deserving of the praise they get. Even the ones that had extremely rough launches like Rome 2 morphed into something great over time. And just from one tiny little paragraph or looking at a building or character, you are able to decode so much information that it feels mind-boggling that this is how real life was like so long ago. And as the present slowly moves with us, so does this knowledge. And these games serve as a pillar that helps us hold up this virtual library of Alexandria. Thank you for watching, and see you next time, I guess. Alright, bye.